The $1 trillion infrastructure bill was just released today, and this thing is comprehensive to say the least. If you're an American, this bill will absolutely impact you in some way, but there's an issue with this. It's extremely dense and 2,700 pages long, 2,700 pages. It's insane. So I've taken it upon myself to break this program down into 11 major categories and then break that into 57 subcategories so you can better understand what is in this behemoth of a bill. And then I'm losing my mind because I've been looking at this all day, and if I see the word infrastructure one more time, I might just crack. So this bill covers everything from water to airlines to grant programs to ways to decrease your internet bill and literally everything in between. So let's go ahead and jump right in, shall we? So if we cut over here to the iPad, here are the 11 major areas of spending, and this is just new spending. About half the bill is new spending, and the other half the bill is just increased spending on current contracts or current obligations. So we're going to cover mostly new contracts. In here, we have the largest $110 billion for roads and bridges, $46 billion for resiliency. Don't worry, you'll understand what that is. $55 billion for water infrastructure, $73 billion for power and grid infrastructure, $7.5 billion for school bus and ferry emissions. I know that's weird that that's a major category. $25 billion for airports, $17.3 billion for ports and waterways, $65 billion for broadband internet, $39.2 billion for public transit, $11 billion for safety, and $66 billion for passenger, freight, and rail. And then if you want to look at this in another view, I broke this down into a bar chart as well. That way you can see the proportions. I know some people just like different charts versus others. Feel free to pause that if you want to analyze it a little bit further. And now let's start breaking this down. The first one is roads, bridges, and major projects. $110.8 billion here. So we have $36.735 billion for bridge grant programs. And with this is just the repair and replacement of outdated bridges. And they're doing this because studies show that a large percentage of bridges in the US are outdated or structurally need work. Next, we have the RAISE grant program here, $7.5 billion. This is funding for roads, rails, and ship transportation. Basically, everything but air travel is covered in some way through the RAISE grant, and this is a program through the DOT, the Department of Transportation. Then we have multimodal freight transportation, $6 billion here. This is for freight infrastructure, culvert replacement in streets, research and development, and improves states' freight plans. And then we have the infra grant program. This is $3.2 billion. This one does a lot of things, especially a lot for Amtrak. You'll notice Amtrak is a very frequent mention in this video, and it'll seem like there's a lot of overlapping where multiple programs almost seem to do the same thing for Amtrak. But with this, there's oversight for Amtrak spending, coincidentally enough, rail safety improvements, rail noise emissions improvements, and actually, interestingly enough, this updates the Amtrak smoking policy as well. So like I said, this thing is comprehensive, if nothing else. Then we have the Appalachian Highway. So this is funding for the 13 Appalachian states and the roadways that connect those. So they're saying that these are historically isolated communities, and this will help spur economic activity by adding $1.25 billion there. Then we have $55.52 billion for increased existing contracts. So with these other items, they are entirely new grant programs or bills that were combined into this greater infrastructure bill. This is just increased funding for current contracts to help hit the infrastructure goals. So if you look at the bill itself, most, if not all of the items in this bill are funding broken over 5 years. It's funding every single year for 5 years in order to hit the goal of that specific line item. Then we have some increased existing contracts in there as well to help, again, hit those goals. And then finally, we just have some other items here for $500 million, transportation bonds, and university transportation. Oh, also, I have a huge announcement. I have started a daily briefing newsletter. I realized that, I spend like 8 hours a day reading and learning about current events, and most topics just simply don't merit an entire video. So I decided to start this newsletter to cover the top news stories for each day in an easily digestible and kind of witty format sent for free directly to your email inbox. So this is still in beta stages. It's just starting out. So I'm only accepting 1,000 signups initially as I test things out and work out all the kinks before I do a complete open. So if you want to be one of the first to join, do so ASAP through the link at the top of my description. I'm really really excited about it. Now, getting back into it, we have passenger, freight, and rail. As I mentioned, there is a lot about trains here and a lot about the Amtrak. So first off, we have $6 billion for the Northeast Corridor grants. This is basically funding for a maintenance backlog for Amtrak between Washington and Boston. And this also includes rail and safety improvements, lighting improvements, and research for the railway. Then we have the Inner City Passenger Rail, $36 billion here. That's a ton of funding. This covers research and development, a study on trains longer than 7,500 feet. That's more than a mile long train. Rail restorations and enhancements to railways, $16 billion towards the Amtrak National Network. Now, with this, it's just modernization and updated stations on Amtrak routes and collision prevention and a few other line items to the tune of $16 billion. Then we have Rail Infrastructure and Safety, acronym CRISI, for $5 billion, and then $3 billion for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program. This is just the removal of hazardous railway crossings or the fixing of hazardous railway crossings, $3 billion towards that. Next up, we have public transit. So first off, we have another huge item, $19.15 billion for increased current contracts. What this is a 43% increase in funding for the next 5 years in established transit programs, again, to hit those infrastructure goals. And then we have $4.75 billion for what's called the State of Good Repair. And this covers the 40% of buses and 23% of rail assets that are in poor conditions and supports the repair and maintenance of those assets. We have $8 billion in capital investment grants. This is funding for new and expanded commuter and light rail projects, bus services, and ferry services. There's a lot of bus and ferry business going on in this infrastructure bill as well. Senior and disabled mobility. So this just removes barrier to transportation for all, and funding for areas of all sizes. So rural areas are included here as well. And $5.25 billion for what's called the Low-No program. So this is for the purchase and lease of zero/low emission buses. A big focus on that as well in this bill. Next up, we have safety and research. So let's take a look here first at the increased contracts with the FMCSA and the NHTSA. That's the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. An increase of $2.25 billion to those departments. Safe Streets for All, $5 billion here. This includes plans to reduce crashes and fatalities of cyclists and pedestrians on streets. So addressing areas that have especially high levels of accidents. We have highway safety programs here to the tune of $1.1 billion. That includes plans to improve driver behavior and safety. I'm not sure how they're going to improve behavior, but that's up to them to figure out. We have the FMCSA increase in funding here for commercial safety, about $500 million there. We have the PHMSA, a lot of acronyms here. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials funding, just increased funding for more safety here. And then $0.7 billion just for other. There was a bunch of small line items in this one. Next up, we have airports. So first off, we have the Formula Airport funding. So they have a formula that just determines funding for all airports and then gives the airports the discretion to spend those funds on needed areas like runways, taxiways, noise reduction, terminal. They basically say, you know your airport better than us, you spend this how you need to spend it. We have $5 billion in discretionary funding here, and this is for small airports. And then we have $5 billion for funding at air traffic control. And this is funding for FAA and ATC facilities and towers. Then we have ports and waterways. So first off with the Army Corps of Engineers here, $9.55 billion. And this is funding for project backlogs, inland waterways, ecosystem restoration, shore protection, and a whole lot more. There was like 30 items here for the Army Corps of Engineers. Then we have port infrastructure here and marine highways, $2.3 billion. This is improvements to port facilities on coasts, rivers, and the Great Lakes. We have about $500 million to the U.S. Coast Guard, almost $1 billion to ferry and terminal construction, $3.85 billion to land ports of entry. This is just port modernization and increased border security at ports, and $400 million here to help with truck emissions at ports with all the semi-trucks driving around causing all these emissions. Next up, we have broadband internet. Now this one has some really interesting stuff in it. First off, we have private activity bonds. Private activity bonds here. $600 million. That's funding for broadband in rural areas that just don't have as great of internet service. We have affordability, construction, and tech, $18.65 billion. So as a part of this, they have what's called middle mile improvement. So it's the improvement and acquisition of companies who assist in the transmission of broadband internet. So this could be telecommunications companies, tech companies, and electric utilities. This could be where a lot of companies get some large contracts from the government. And also included within this section is subsidized broadband rates for certain areas. Now this might be something that could be of interest to you. There were some examples of subsidized internet bills, dropping your bill down from $80 to $30 a month, whatever that might be. So keep an lookout over the next year or so for programs in your area that may lower your internet bill. I know every single time I've ever moved, my internet bill has gone up dramatically. It just seems like it's getting more and more expensive. Then we have tribal grants, $2 billion here to improve internet services in tribal areas. We have support for rural areas. Again, kind of the same deal there. The Department of Agriculture here is actually taking the reins, and they plan to fund construction and improvement of broadband services in rural areas. Then we have grants to states, $40 billion in grants to states to improve internet. The goal here is to meet 100 megabyte download speed and 20 megabyte upload speeds in basically all areas, and 10% of the funding here has to go to areas that have especially high cost internet. So where internet is especially expensive, that way we can lower that price a little bit and just make it more reasonable, because internet is basically a utility at this point. And then we have $2.75 billion for what's called inclusion. This is grant programs for communities that lack skills and access to broadband. That's directly from that 2,700 page document. Now we have power and grid. This one was really confusing. This took me a long time to go through. Power and grid and water were kind of like commingled here. So I did my best to parse this out. You'll see what I mean. So first off, grid infrastructure, $28.76 billion. This does a lot of things. A few of the items here include prevention of power outages, reliability and resilience, increased grid flexibility, demonstration of electric vehicle battery second life. Now this one is really interesting. There's a plan to try and take the batteries from electric vehicles and then use them on grid sites after they're done being used in electric vehicles. That way you don't just have to throw away the battery. There might be some use for it on a grid. And then increase grid cybersecurity, all included within that $28.7 billion. Then we have $8.62 billion in clean energy funding. Now I know this is one of those issues where half the aisle wanted more funding here, the other half wanted less. But either way, it includes earth mapping research, minerals research, an energy recycling grant program, and establishes the 21st Century Energy Workforce Advisory Board. Then fuels and tech got $27.85 billion. So as a part of this, we have carbon transport infrastructure, carbon removal through direct air capture hubs, hydrogen research, planning for micro and small modular nuclear reactors. I'm gonna have to look into that a little bit further. It sounds pretty interesting. Nuclear credit program, and a whole lot more in that $27 billion. And then we have hydroelectric power. So this is an increase in the research and development of hydroelectricity. There's some incentives here for the production of it and improvements to hydroelectricity facilities. Now we have water infrastructure. This one, again, like I said, was kind of confusing to go through, so we're going to do our best here. We have $8.3 billion for what's called the Western Water Infrastructure. This does a lot of things, including addressing aging infrastructure, increased water storage, desalination projects, which is just reducing salt from water, salt water to regular water, dam safety, drought protection research, and water recycling. Now, the other three items on here, I estimated the amount because I knew the total amount, but I had a hard time segmenting this into main categories. So these numbers might be a little bit off, but the areas of focus are correct. So we have clean water funding, we have drinking water funding, and wastewater funding. Again, for all of those, just looking to treat water in more effective and efficient ways and make sure that all residents of the United States have access to clean drinking water, getting rid of lead pipes and things like that. Now we have resiliency. We're almost to the end here. Resiliency, $46 billion here. So FEMA funding first. This one includes projects to reduce the risks of natural disasters, the side effects of natural disasters. Then we have waste management here. $800 million for waste management. This is recycling education, battery recycling, ocean debris reduction, and EPA pollution prevention. Then we have drought resiliency, which is up here, $6.46 billion. This is funds for aging, drought, and water infrastructure, sanitation and water infrastructure on tribal lands, watershed improvements, and energy bill assistance for low-income families. Now, this one might also interest you. They're talking about a program where in the summers, when your energy bill is so high from the air conditioner, you may be able to get a subsidized electricity bill through one of these programs. Again, that's another one of those things. Keep an eye out because there may be a program available in your area for something like that. Then we have ecosystem resiliency, $3.5 billion here. This includes funding for lakes and natural habitats. Then we have wildfire management, $8.14 billion. And this is wildfire management and restoration, burned area rehab, forest service funding, and wildfire mitigation, just protocols for the increase in wildfires that we've had. Cyber resilience, $1.31 billion. This has been a huge issue recently with all these cyber attacks on utilities and pipelines and things like that. So with this, they're looking to develop a consensus on how the U.S. can best defend against cyber attacks and give funding to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to help battle these issues and do some more risk management studies, because again, this has been a huge problem. And then we have a huge other here for $24.78 billion. This just includes things like water, power, rail resiliency, port resiliency. This whole bill is kind of resiliency in itself. And a lot of these, like I said, tie into each other. So sometimes it's hard to segment individual categories. And finally, we have the last one, school bus and ferry emissions. So we have the Clean School Bus program here for $5 billion. This is funding for low and zero emission buses. We have the Ferry Grant program here, $1.25 billion, just increased funding to produce more ferries. The Electric Ferry Pilot Program, this is $250 million. This is grants for the purchase of low emission and electric ferries. And then we have the Rural Ferry Programs to help get ferries in rural areas. And there you have it, 2,700 pages of bill text summarized with some nice looking graphics. So if you enjoyed this presentation, just make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. That way I know that I'm doing some good work over here. And also make sure you join the newsletter ASAP. I will put this presentation in my next newsletter. That way you can save it and have it as a PDF as well. Again, there's limited spots there, so grab yours ASAP to grab a beta spot. Be one of the first to join. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.